All right, so as I said in that news item earlier today, I want to go through the different reading sequence assignments and sort of give you examples of sort of exactly what I'm looking for, just in case my feedback that you've gotten in the first now two submissions hasn't been enough. So starting with the week 4 submissions for these things, that is the stuff that you're doing this week, I'll be grading sort of more strictly. Um, so far, I've been kind of lenient, and I've mostly, with at least the reading sequence stuff, I've given you feedback about, well, next time you should do this, next time you should do that. Um, Sometimes the feedback doesn't tell you to do anything different. I'm just kind of getting you to think about stuff more. So in order that you can look at those first 2 weeks of feedback and figure out which type of feedback is me telling you what to do differently and which type of feedback is just me kind of getting you to try and think about some stuff more, I want to go through some concrete examples of submissions. So I've cooked up a few myself, and I want to sort of point out what is in these submissions and then also what isn't in these submissions to kind of highlight what I am looking for, what I want you to do, and then of course what I also don't want you to do. So first, let's look at these in order, the order that which you do them. So first we'll look at the active reading thing. So let's make this a bit bigger. So with the active reading, for the most part, people are doing that pretty well. There's a couple of things that a good number of people have done. So one, some of you have not made it clear which part is your view before you did the reading and which part is your view after you did the reading. So I think, let me make sure that you can see this. So you indicate that you don't have to do it exactly this way, but something such that it's very clear to me which question you're addressing, and also for each question, whether this is your view beforehand or afterwards. A lot of people have done it something like this, where you clearly mark, well, here's the first question, and then you say, well, before, and then you have a second section which is sort of separated by a space or whatever, and after. It's clearly indicated like that. That's certainly a very clear way to go. You don't necessarily have to do it this way. You could just start with saying, question 1, before I read it, I assumed blah, blah, blah. And then without like changing paragraph, you can say, well, but afterwards I thought this instead. So you could keep it as kind of one paragraph. Do make sure that you separate your answers to however many questions there may be for the active reading, though. Another thing that a lot of people didn't do is that with the after part, and just the after part, you are meant to be telling me whether or not your initial impression, your initial interpretation was changed or stayed the same in the course of the reading. And to sort of explain why it either changed or stayed the same, you need to indicate some particular part of the text that we were reading, right? So you'd put in something like I have here, like a page number about where, in this case, Kuhn said something and you thought, oh, now I understand. This has made me change my mind. Or you identify part of Kuhn's argument where he's trying to change your mind. You think, well, here's him trying to make the argument, but I don't think it works. And then you'd explain why, right? So I'll read this out before. I assumed that theory change in science proceeded only by the objective evaluation of data. A theory would be retained for as long as experimental results supported it and rejected once sufficiently many experimental results falsified it, right? So in the before thing, you haven't read the text. There's nothing for you to cite. You're just reading the question and responding to it intuitively, right? The after part, you've now read, or after or during, right? So once you've started reading the relevant text, then you'd write something like this. Kuhn's suggestion that scientists make decisions much like anyone else in an institutional setting is at least plausible. While some part of a decision to adopt a new theory may be motivated by experimental data, no doubt some of it is often socially, politically, or aesthetically motivated. I didn't really finish that sentence there. And right there, you'd put a page number or like the premise of his argument where he says that, something to that effect. On the plausible assumption, to be confirmed, denied by study of scientific decision-making, that scientists are not generally more rational than normal people, I have changed my view to agree with Kuhn's argument, right? So that tells me you've changed your mind from your initial impression. It tells me where in the text the sort of change of opinion occurred and why that little piece of text made you change your opinion, right? So I always want you to explain things. Whenever you're arguing, you always need to say why you've made this conclusion. Never assume that someone understands why you've said what you said, or even what you've said, right? So this is why philosophers often, and philosophy papers, tend to be sometimes a little bit pedantic. They tend to be overlong, because the philosopher doesn't want to assume that anyone agrees with anything that they think, or understands necessarily exactly what they're saying. So they're very clear about everything, sometimes to a fault, sometimes too much. But I think it would be better to err on the side of caution and make sure that everyone understands you. Now, obviously, you don't want to be condescending to them. You want to avoid that. But you can be explicit and clear without being condescending. Question 2. So same kind of thing here. You'd say before, it seems clear that we know more about physics now than 300 years ago. Simply look at all the technological innovations that we've developed in that time, which are dependent on our best physics theories. So in this second after thing, I've disagreed with Kuhn. And so let's see how that works. Kuhn makes the point that theory change in science often involves a discontinuity between the terms used for measurements and whatnot. This discontinuity, he says, prevents us from saying we have made theoretical progress understood in terms of some more accurate grasp of objective truth, which would indicate that we don't know more about physics than we did 300 years ago. Though this is true in one sense, I think that he puts too much on the idea of exact matching between the definitions of terms. Why is that needed for theoretical progress to be measured? Even if it is, there is still some sense in which we understand the physical world better, even if that doesn't mean we have more individual, knowledgeable beliefs about it. We are better at predicting and intervening on it, after all. So the only thing that's missing here, you can see, is that there's not a page number reference. So even though I do refer to something very specific that Kuhn says, namely that there's a discontinuity between theoretical terms in different paradigms, I don't tell us where I found that in the text. So this example here, so this is good. This is sort of, I don't want to say it's wrong, but so this is like a check plus, and then this would be a check minus. Because you've done most of the work you were supposed to here, but you've left something out. And so you technically would be, not technically, you will lose points if you don't put in these little indexes, these indices to tell me where you've changed your mind. So I've explained why, and I've given a vague indication of where in the text, but I need something very specific, right? This may seem like busy work, but I'm trying to give you a good method for going through readings, complicated long readings, and sort of keeping track of your own thoughts. In these very short chapters, this may not be terribly helpful, and again, it may seem like busy work, but at least I have found that when you're reading like a whole book for a project, if you're writing a very long paper and you need to keep track of exactly where in your various sources you had this idea that gave you, this thing that you're going to write, you want to have all that plotted out so that you don't have to exhaustively go back looking through the whole book again to find it, right? You could obviously do this with physical bookmarks in the book as well, but you want to have sort of concurrent notes to go with those bookmarks to explain what those bookmarks mean. You don't necessarily have to do it this way in your own reading outside of this class, but I'm want you to try out this exercise as a way to sort of clarify to yourself even your own thought processes and sort of mark them out so that you could return to them later if you wanted to write some sort of paper or presentation on the basis of your readings. So that's what I want to do for the active reading. One further thing I want to point out is that for the active reading, for the group discussion, and for the individual summary, there's a very specific one of the texts, one of the chapters that I want you to look at. Some people have been giving me summaries and been talking in their active reading about the whole reading list, or one particular part of the reading list which isn't the one that I'm looking for. So I've said this a couple of times, so I'm going to point it out again. If you go to the reading list, you'll note that there is one part which says covered in lecture, right? So that's what I talk about in the recordings. That's what's in the slides. You do need to know this stuff, and things about it will show up on quiz questions, and of course later on exam questions, and it will help you, hopefully, in understanding the thing for the reading sequence and whatnot. But note, very specifically, this says for the reading sequence assignments, right? Only this is for the reading sequence assignments. So in this week, week 4, when you, and all subsequent weeks, pay close attention to this. So for week 4, for the active reading, for the group discussion, and for the individual summary, you are only talking about Hume and the problem of induction, textbook chapter 45. You are not directly engaging with Hume's argument against miracles, right? That's not what those assignments are about. So speaking of the group discussion, I've made a little toy post, a little example post in the, oops, no, not that. Here down at the bottom, so example topic. So what I want you to do each week is post your own original post in which you say something about, how, well, guided by the questions or the prompts that are given in the instructions, sort of how you responded to the reading this week. And that is, again, the particular reading indicated as being for the reading sequence assignments. So here we have an example which is, sort of from like the week 1 readings. So you're supposed to imagine this is 2 people. It's actually just me responding to myself, but for the purposes of illustration, I thought this would be good enough. So you would have an original post. So this would be, say, your original post, and you write something. When Nietzsche says that God is dead and that humans killed him, he means that God's actual real existence depends on having enough people believe in him. So God did exist up until Nietzsche's time and then died because people started looking to science to explain things in their life. So I'm not saying that anyone said anything like this or that it's plausible. I'm just trying to give you an example of something, this kind of Peter Pan, you got to believe in fairies or else they die kind of stuff. That is a possible but incredibly unlikely interpretation that someone might get out of the Nietzsche argument. And it's not totally bonkers. It's not correct. It's not the best interpretation, but it's not totally bonkers either. You can imagine someone thinking that. And then they might, respond to this interpretation of Nietzsche's argument and say, well, this doesn't really make sense to me. What kind of living thing, much less an all-powerful living thing, can be killed just because people don't believe in it? As much as I want them to, the hornets on my porch don't go away just because I stop acknowledging them, right? So this is the format the post can take. They don't have to be super formal. They just have to address the topic in a kind of conversational way. So that would be an original post. Everyone needs to make an original post. Then you also need to respond to somebody's post. It may turn out that not everyone's original post gets responded to. That's fine, but everyone needs to make a response to someone else's post. And not everyone has been doing that in the discussion forum. Some people just make their original post. Some people just make a response and then don't do anything else. That won't cut it starting this week. You need to have 2 distinct posts. And I've changed the infrastructure of the group discussion. It's not going to make any difference to you, but the way that it's graded will now be each week is graded separately as opposed to having this running grade. And so that will start this week and continue going forward. So here's what a response post might look like. Nietzsche didn't mean that humans literally killed an entity which was previously living. It's more like we killed God than God. What I mean is that we stopped using the concept as much, and so it became dead. People stopped living their life in the constant thought of the concept. It stopped being their natural way of explaining things. For Nietzsche, I think God is dead means something like we might say when what we might mean when we say Latin, the language, is dead. No one uses it anymore, right? And so, someone might, a response from this original person might be, could you elaborate on what you mean when you say the language is dead? How does that correspond? And you could go back and forth like that. So, in addition to original post, response post, your response post needs to be substantive. A lot of response posts I've seen from people are like, oh, yes, I like this point and I agree with it. I like the way that you talked about this. I mean, that is a response, but I'm hoping to get something more substantive, right? I'm hoping to get something more than just people registering their agreement and disagreement with a particular post. You need to do a little bit more work than that. And the little bit more work could be as much as simply explaining in a bit more detail why you agree with what the person said. I'm not saying you have to disagree with them. I'm not saying you have to make some, create an argument. I just want you to say something, so suppose someone did agree with this first interpretation. Someone could say, this was my interpretation too. I don't see any way of interpreting Nietzsche and the word and the phrase God is dead and we killed him, because you could give the extended quote where Nietzsche says, we killed him and we have blood on our hands or something. If we take that literally, it has to mean that there was an actual entity which we killed. But I am also confused as to how we could kill an actual entity by ceasing to believe in it. And then someone could give an example. Your example of the hornets not going away makes sense to me. So essentially they're just agreeing, but they're being a bit more expansive about their agreement. So at the very least, be more expansive about your agreement. If you disagree, and people when they have disagreed in these posts have tended to explain it, people just when they agree haven't explained their agreement. So please explain your agreement, right? Hopefully that's pretty clear. So just to reiterate once again, in order to get full credit for the discussion posts, you need to have an original post and a response post. What's more, that response post needs to be more than just sort of saying, yep, thumbs up, right? Finally, we have the individual summary examples. So with this, I've given you a guideline where I want it to be around 150 words. If you're a little bit more than that, that's fine. So the example I have here is 168 words. And that can be difficult, right? Especially with the longer pieces and the longer arguments. But it's a skill, right? It's a skill to learn to be able to sort of boil down a long paper, a long argument into the highlights, right? So think about a highlight reel for, a football game. They don't show you the whole game, right? But you get a sense of how the game went by them showing you 4 or 5 plays. That's exactly what these individual summaries are. They're basically highlight reels. So think about what the most important parts are from the particular argument that you're covering, and then explain those, right? Put those out there. And then you give your analysis of those highlights, right? Again, just like a sportscaster would. So let me just read to you the example I have here. Kuhn argues 2 things. First, that the adoption of a new scientific paradigm does not occur solely, or even mostly, on the basis of experimental evidence. Instead, new paradigms are adopted for social, political, or aesthetic reasons. Hence, paradigm changes are not rational. Second, He claims that different scientific paradigms cannot be compared to each other. They are incommensurable because their central terms have meanings that are not identical. These two arguments together lead Kuhn to conclude that changes in scientific theory do not constitute steady progress toward objective truth. So that's the summary part, right? And so the summary part itself is 90 words, okay? In those 90 words, I have encapsulated the two different arguments that were in that chapter. I want to note a couple things. First, I am engaging directly with Kuhn's argument. I am not talking about the textbook author's presentation of his argument. And I've said this to a couple of people in their feedback where they have been talking about whether the authors of the textbook did a good job of putting forward their argument. What the author of the textbook's argument is. Sort of imagine that we're looking through those authors, right, into what Kuhn actually says. Because we're not reading Kuhn directly, we're using this sort of secondary source. We have to deal with the fact that it was written by someone that's not Kuhn. So it's true that they are giving a particular interpretation, and their interpretation might be bad. Ignore that. We don't have any way, given the resources that we're using in this class, to judge whether their interpretation of Kuhn is any good. We are trying to judge whether Kuhn himself and his arguments are any good based on what the authors of the textbook tell us. So look straight through the authors and to the person that they're talking about, or the argument they're talking about. So you see nowhere in here do I mention the authors of the particular article, just Kuhn. You don't have to tell me that Kuhn, where he wrote this, like in the Structure of Scientific Revolution. You don't have to tell me things like that. You don't have to give me bibliographical information. Go straight into the summary, right? So I just say, Kuhn argues two things, and here they are. Okay, that's what the summary should look like. And that's one part of what the individual summary submission should have in them. Additionally, I ask you to evaluate, right? So that's the second part here. The first prong of Kuhn's argument is persuasive, provided it actually characterizes institutional behavior in science. This is a matter for empirical investigation. The second prong relies on an exact similarity of reference for theoretical terms between paradigms. Exact similarity of meaning is not, I think, generally required for understanding I've messed this sentence up. For understanding and making comparison, right? Not generally required for understanding and making comparison between views in normal communication. Unless Kuhn provides a reason that such similarity is required in the case of scientific discourse, the second prong seems weak. Okay? So your evaluation can be short. You don't have to make this like conclusive case for why Kuhn is wrong. You just have to say, oh, I don't think Kuhn's right, and here's a little bit of a taste of why I don't think he's right. You can't just say, oh, I disagree with it, I think it's wrong. You can't just say, oh, this seems a little bit funny to me. You need to explain a little bit why you disagree. Just like if you agree or disagree with somebody in the group discussion, you have to give a little indication of why that is. And you can see this is a total of 169 words, just a little bit over the 150, but that's fine. And again, I'm not going to count words. Unless it's obviously, just by me sort of eyeballing it, over the word limit, I'm not going to worry about it. If it's obviously long, I'm going to say something about it, and I will take points off. So if it's a whole page is about 250 words if you sort of double-space stuff. So that's obviously too long. That's almost 2 times too long. We don't want that, right? And over time, you will get better at sort of paring down what you say. And so, like I said, I don't put any bibliographical information in here. I don't need to tell you what the title of the argument is or the title of the book, because the assignment is only about one thing, right? And so you can assume that I know what book or argument you're talking about, as long as you're doing the right one. And so once again, this is only about the thing that was not discussed in the lecture, the thing which was specifically indicated in the reading list to be for the reading sequence assignments, right? All right, so Hopefully now you have a pretty good idea of what I'm looking for in each of the reading sequence assignments. I have some specific written examples here that I've showed you, and I've told you specifically what kinds of things you do need to be doing, what kinds of things you don't need to be doing or shouldn't do in these, and hopefully that will hopefully that combined with any feedback that I've already given you in the first 2 weeks, and then with the third week, once I get done with that, will help you going forward. And remember that you are responsible for knowing all of this and for adhering to these criteria, starting with this week's Week 4's assignments. Any feedback that I've given you which hasn't been telling you, hey, next time you should do this, or, well, remember that you're supposed to be doing this, any of that kind of feedback is kind of just meant to make you think a little bit more. If I've said, well, if what you're saying is true, then what about this other thing? That's not the kind of thing that I would take off points for. I'm just, picking up on this thread of conversation that you've left out and sort of saying, well, when you think about this later, presuming that you do think about these things later after you're done with a particular unit, you might want to consider this. I should also note that when I say that if I don't give you any feedback, if I just say that this is good, what I'm saying is that you've fulfilled the parameters of the assignment. I am not endorsing any content, right? I'm not saying that, oh, yes, you are exactly right, because this is all matters of interpretation and argument. Your argument can be good, but still wrong. Your interpretation can be plausible, but still not the most plausible. In addition, when you're reading these texts, especially in the active reading, you don't have to change your mind, right? You don't have to assume that because these people are, famous as philosophers and they have published arguments, that means that they're right and you're wrong. You can feel free to disagree with them and resist their arguments as long as you tell me why, right? Give me an explanation of why you disagree, okay? The purpose of this class is not to change anyone's mind about anything. I'm not trying to convince you that Kuhn is right and that, science doesn't make progress. As a matter of fact, just to give you an idea, I don't happen to agree with that personally, as you might kind of get an idea from this individual summary. I think Kuhn gets some things right, but the strong interpretation that science doesn't progress and that we don't know any more than we used to, I don't think that's correct. I'm not going to get into why, and generally when I give you feedback in the vein of you should maybe think about this, I'm not telling you what my view is. I'm not trying to push any view on you, right? I'm just concerned with you being able to put forward clearly and support clearly your own opinions and interpretations. And part of that is getting you to be able to respond to feedback, right? Being able to take in other people's opinions and advice, consider them, and then on the basis of that consideration, earnest consideration of what other people have said, you can either change your mind or not change your mind, right? As long as you are, you sort of have good reason for it. So I think I've covered anything. If you have any questions on the basis of this, the basis of how this will affect grading going forward, you can of course email me, but hopefully this has all been pretty clear.